The explosions of Zorgax bombs flattened the last great city of Elysia, leaving Kaid with nowhere left to run and nothing left to lose. The Zorgax extinction of his people would soon be complete, unless something truly unbelievable happened. Kaid stood amidst the scorched rubble and towering ruins of what had been his species' thriving capital. The bodies of countless dead Elysian soldiers and civilians littered the cratered streets, their bright purple blood staining the shattered concrete. Acrid smoke stung Kaid's eyes as he surveyed the devastation through cracked goggles, his breath rasping through his helmet's respirator. The ancient skyscrapers that had stood for millennia now lay toppled like a child's carelessly scattered toys. This had been their last bastion, their final fortified refuge against the ruthless Zorgax, and now it too had fallen after a century of brutal warfare. With most of their fleet destroyed, armies shattered, and population decimated, the Elysian leadership saw only one desperate hope for survival: to seek the aid of the legendary humans. Spoken of only in whispers and shrouded in mystery, little was known about the humans except fantastical tales of their cunning, tenacity, and incomprehensible technology. But with the Zorgax preparing a final assault to eradicate the broken remains of Elysian resistance, the humans represented their sole remaining chance. The Elysian Supreme Council tasked Kaid with leading this vital mission. As one of their most skilled and trusted soldiers, battle-hardened by decades on the front lines against the Zorgax, Kaid was ordered to take a small ship and skeleton crew to venture deep into uncharted space. There they must attempt to locate the humans, if they even existed, and somehow persuade them to enter the war on behalf of the Elysians. It was a last-ditch effort bordering on madness, but the only alternative was certain extinction. So Kaid and his crew embarked on this harrowing journey, following fragmentary clues gleaned from ancient star maps, through hostile systems and treacherous nebulae, through ghost-thronged battlefields strewn with derelict hulks, through irradiated dead zones where planets had been cracked apart. The crew pressed on. They endured disasters, repaired with rapidly dwindling supplies, and narrowly evaded prowling Zorgax raiders, all to chase the thinnest thread of hope. Through sheer desperation and determination, they finally reached a dim binary star system on the farthest edges of known space. There, impossibly, they detected a tiny human outpost on a remote moon, little more than a frontier garrison on the edge of a vast wilderness. The outpost was a heavily fortified bunker hunkered in a barren valley of gray dust and bleak rock under perpetually clouded skies. A paltry force of a few dozen human soldiers manned its laser-scarred walls and rusted anti-aircraft guns. As Kaid's ship touched down on the cracked landing pad, he wondered how such a seemingly primitive facility could possibly help his people avert extinction. Kaid and his crew entered the outpost to a wary reception from the small human contingent. Their apparent leader was a gruff, weathered soldier named George Dixon, who had been exiled to command this desolate station as punishment for some unspoken transgression. Kaid pleaded his people's dire case, literally begging the humans for military aid against the genocidal Zorgax. But George and the other humans seemed largely unsympathetic, barely paying attention. These battle-hardened frontier settlers lived by a code of strict independence and non-interference in off-world affairs. What aid could they possibly offer anyway? The outpost's motley array of decrepit shuttles, half-repaired vehicles, and patched-together equipment scarcely seemed adequate to defend itself, let alone turn the tide of a galactic war. When Kaid shared holograms of Elysian technological achievements, the humans simply shrugged, seemingly unimpressed by what they considered primitive tools. A cultural chasm gaped between the two species, and Kaid began to lose all hope that salvation could come from these disinterested savages. But then disaster struck, as a massive Zorgax raider vessel suddenly emerged from warp and opened fire on the tiny outpost without warning or mercy. Massive blasts rained down, breaching the walls and turning swaths of the compound to molten sludge. As alarms wailed, George rushed to mobilize the human defenders while screaming at Kaid to get his crew to safety. But Kaid and his Elysian soldiers chose instead to stand and fight alongside the humans, in those blood-slick corridors and flame-swept battlements. Together, human and Elysian alike fought in desperate unity against the invading Zorgax boarding parties. Elysians with their sleek rifles and humans with their formidable but ugly chemically propelled guns. Both George and Kaid fought on the front lines, slaughtering waves of armored Zorgax troopers in brutal close-quarters combat. Elysian and human blood mingled on the blasted floors as soldiers from both species died to defend the battered outpost. In the end, the improbable alliance triumphed, obliterating the Zorgax invaders through bravery and sacrifice, but at the cost of many lives, humans and Elysians alike. As silence fell over the smoking ruins of the outpost, Kaid and George clasped hands in newfound respect between their species, forged in the white heat of shared battle. George brought Kaid before the surviving human leadership to make the case that the Zorgax would surely target humanity next if the Elysians fell. The grizzled old soldier volunteered to lead a crack force to accompany Kaid's crew back to Elysia, to spearhead the human intervention. They would act as an advance guard while the main human battle fleets mobilized to follow. So Kaid, George, and their ragged combined crew of Elysian and human survivors raced back to Elysia, knowing that a truly titanic Zorgax armada was gathering in orbit, preparing a final assault to eradicate the last pockets of Elysian resistance. Impossibly outnumbered, outgunned, and on the verge of starvation and collapse, only this unlikely alliance of human and Elysian warriors had any hope of preventing the total annihilation of the Elysian species. The future of an entire civilization now hinged on a mistrustful partnership between the desperate survivors of two wildly different cultures, both battered and diminished. The Zorgax were coming to wipe the Elysians from the cosmos forever, unless the legendary humans proved more than a myth and arrived in time to help drive back the Zorgax hordes. Kaid's ship burst out of hyperspace into the Elysian system, alarms blaring as sensors detected the massive Zorgax armada already in orbit. George Dixon rushed to the cockpit, his face grim as he surveyed the tactical readouts. "Damn, we're too late," he muttered. "They've started the assault." Through the view screen, they watched helplessly as Zorgax warships rained hellfire onto the Elysian homeworld. The planet's defensive shields flickered and failed under the relentless barrage. "We need more time," George said, his mind racing. He turned to Kaid. "Their command ship. Can we get to it?" Kaid's eyes widened. "It's heavily guarded, but yes, I believe so." "Then that's our target. We take out their command. We buy the Elysians the time they need." They maneuvered their small vessel through the chaotic battlefield, dodging debris and weapons fire. Using Kaid's knowledge of Zorgax tactics, they approached the massive command ship from its blind spot. "Ready for this?" George asked, checking his weapons. Kaid nodded grimly. "For my people, always." They docked with the Zorgax vessel, using stolen access codes to bypass initial security. Once inside, all hell broke loose. George's advanced human weaponry tore through Zorgax troops, while Kaid's expertise allowed them to navigate the labyrinthine ship. They fought their way deck by deck, leaving a trail of Zorgax corpses in their wake. George's rifle spat superheated plasma bolts while Kaid wielded a Zorgax energy blade with lethal precision. Finally, they reached the command center. The doors hissed open to reveal Krav, the feared Zorgax warlord. He towered over them, mandibles clicking in anticipation. "Elysian vermin," Krav snarled, "and their new pets. You will die screaming." The battle was ferocious. Krav's elite guards swarmed them, but George and Kaid fought back to back, covering each other's vulnerabilities. George's rifle overheated, and he was forced into hand-to-hand combat, trading blows with the massive Zorgax. Kaid dispatched the last guard just as George managed to get Krav in a chokehold. The warlord's eyes bulged as George squeezed. "It's over," George growled. But Krav wasn't finished. With his dying breath, he activated the ship's self-destruct sequence. Alarms blared as George and Kaid sprinted for their lives. They barely made it back to their ship and disengaged as the Zorgax command vessel exploded in a massive fireball. The Zorgax fleet, suddenly leaderless, fell into disarray. But their victory was short-lived. A new Zorgax commander quickly assumed control, and soon dropships were descending on the Elysian surface en masse. George took charge of the battered Elysian defenses, integrating his small human force with the local resistance. They fought street by street, repelling Zorgax assaults with a combination of guerrilla tactics and superior human technology. George's leadership and tactical acumen began to turn the tide, giving the Elysians hope. Then reports came in of a new Zorgax weapon, a bioagent spreading rapidly through Elysian population centers. Victims suffered agonizing deaths as their bodies literally dissolved from within. "We need that antidote," Cade said, his voice heavy with desperation. George nodded grimly. "Then let's go get it." They assembled a small strike team and set out for the Zorgax science facility. The journey was harrowing. They navigated treacherous mountain passes while evading Zorgax patrols. Booby traps claimed 2 of their team before they even reached the facility. Inside, they faced Crag Thule, leader of the Zorgax's elite Deathbringer squad. The ensuing firefight was brutal and costly. George watched in horror as Kaid took a blast meant for him, collapsing in a pool of purple blood. With a roar of fury, George cut down Crag Thule and secured the antidote. But as he cradled his gravely wounded friend, he realized the war was nowhere near the end. The Zorgax were regrouping for a final push. The plague still ravaged Elysian cities, and now Kaid's life hung by a thread. George looked out over the war-torn Elysian landscape, knowing that everything hinged on what happened next. Somehow, he had to rally their battered forces for one last stand. The fate of an entire species depended on it. George Dixon wiped sweat from his brow as he surveyed the makeshift fortifications. Exhausted Elysian and human soldiers worked side by side, hauling rubble and setting up defensive positions. The acrid stench of smoke hung in the air. "How's it looking, sir?" asked an Elysian lieutenant. George grunted. "It'll have to do. We don't have much time left." He strode through the bustling command center, barking orders and reviewing tactical displays. A young Elysian scientist burst in, waving a data pad. "Commander Dixon, we've made a breakthrough with the antidote," she exclaimed. George's eyes narrowed. "What kind of breakthrough?" "It's derived from a rare mineral. We've traced its origin to an uninhabited planet in the Oort cloud." George nodded grimly. "Assemble a team. We leave in 30 minutes. Soon their small craft touched down on a desolate, windswept world. George led the way, his boots crunching on gray gravel. They rounded a rocky outcropping and froze. Before them stood the crumbling remains of what could only be Zorgax architecture. "What the hell?" muttered Jace, Kaid's second-in-command. A distant rumble caught their attention. Over a nearby ridge, they spotted a Zorgax mining operation in full swing. "Looks like we're not the only ones after this mineral," George growled. They crept closer, using the ruins for cover. George signaled, and they sprang into action. Plasma bolts sizzled through the air as they caught the Zorgax by surprise. George dove behind a half-buried pillar as return fire peppered his position. He popped out to squeeze off a few shots, downing a Zorgax soldier. "Jace, on your 6!" Jace spun, blasting a Zorgax that had flanked their position. The firefight raged on, neither side gaining the upper hand. Back on Elysia, Kaid struggled to his feet, ignoring the pain that lanced through his body. Alarms blared as Zorgax dropships screamed overhead. "Status report," he barked. An aide rushed over. "Sir, they've breached the outer defenses. We're falling back to the central citadel." Kaid nodded grimly. "Prepare for a counterattack. We hit them where they least expect it." On the mineral planet, George's team fought their way into the Zorgax facility. They grabbed as much of the precious mineral as they could carry. "We've got company!" Jace shouted as Zorgax reinforcements poured in. They retreated, Zorgax troops hot on their heels. Jace turned to George, his face set. "Get to the ship. I'll hold them off." Before George could protest, Jace shoved him towards the exit and turned to face the oncoming horde. The last George saw of him was Jace priming a handful of charges. The explosion rocked the entire complex as George's ship lifted off. They emerged from hyperspace into chaos. The Zorgax armada encircled Elysia, their weapons pounding the planet's surface. "Evasive maneuvers," George ordered, as enemy fighters swarmed towards them. The ship jerked and weaved, alarms blaring as they took hit after hit. Through the view screen, George watched Cade's counterattack falter in the face of overwhelming Zorgax numbers. "We're not going to make it," the pilot said, his voice tight with fear. George gripped the back of the pilot's chair. "Like hell we're not. Full power to the engines. We're punching through." The ship screamed as it pushed past its limits, plunging through a hail of weapons fire towards the planet's surface. They crash-landed near the Elysian science facility, George staggering out with the mineral samples. Scientists swarmed over the precious cargo as George collapsed, exhaustion finally overtaking him. He awoke to the sound of cheering. Outside, newly cured Elysians joined the fight, turning the tide against the Zorgax invaders. George found Kaid organizing troops for a final push. "Ready to end this?" George asked. Kaid nodded, a fierce grin on his face. "Let's send these bastards back to whatever hell they crawled out of." Together, they led the charge, human and Elysian alike, towards the heart of the Zorgax offensive. The antidote coursed through Elysian veins, bringing new life to fallen soldiers. They rose from the ground, eyes blazing with renewed purpose. George watched in awe as the reinvigorated troops rejoined the fray, their battle cries drowning out the din of war. But victory was short-lived. The ground shook as a massive Zorgax artillery cannon unleashed its fury. Buildings crumbled under the onslaught of plasma blasts. George's lips pursed as he surveyed the destruction. "We need to take that thing out," he growled. Kaid nodded grimly. "I know where they're keeping it." George assembled his strike team. Colonel Briggs, fresh off the human reinforcement ships, saluted crisply. "Ready to kick some Zorgax ass, sir." Under the cover of darkness, they approached the Zorgax base. Kaid pointed out weak spots in the defenses. Briggs outlined the plan of attack. "Go, go, go," George hissed. They leapt from their transport, rappelling down into the heart of enemy territory. Plasma bolts sizzled past as Zorgax guards opened fire. George's team hit the ground running, cutting through wave after wave of chitinous soldiers. An Elysian soldier fell, clutching a smoking hole in his chest. George dragged him to cover, returning fire with his pulse rifle, the air filled with the stench of ozone and burnt flesh. Inside the base, George split the team. "Kaid, take your group and knock out those firing controls. We'll plant the charges on the main gun." Kaid clasped George's shoulder. "See you on the other side, my friend." George's team fought their way through winding corridors. The cannon's massive barrel loomed ahead, but a hail of enemy fire pinned them down. "We're stuck," shouted one of the human soldiers. Briggs' voice crackled over the comm. "I've got this. When you see your opening, take it." The colonel charged out, guns blazing. Zorgax troops turned to face the new threat. George seized the moment, sprinting for the cannon. He slapped explosive charges onto its base, fingers flying as he armed the detonator. A pained cry echoed through the comms. Kaid's voice, weak but triumphant. "Controls, disabled, cannon, can't fire." The charges blew, ripping the massive weapon apart. George led the survivors through collapsing tunnels as secondary explosions rocked the base. They emerged into chaos, the ground battle raging anew. George's heart sank as he saw Kaid, pale and bleeding. He rushed to his friend's side. "Did we do it?" Kaid whispered. "We did," George choked out. "We won." Kaid's eyes grew distant. "Promise me, you'll finish this, for my people." "I promise," George said, gripping Kaid's hand as the light faded from his eyes. Grief threatened to overwhelm him, but the sounds of battle pulled George back to reality. He stood, facing the remaining human Elysian forces. "For Kaid," he roared, raising his weapon high. "For Elysia." With a thunderous cry, they charged towards the Zorgax lines. George led the attack, Keed's final words etched into his soul. The fate of an entire species hung in the balance as the two armies clashed in what would become the defining moment of the war. The thunderous roar of the Zorgak's artillery cannon's destruction echoed across the battlefield. George Dixon watched as panic spread through enemy ranks. Chitinous bodies scrambled in disarray, abandoning positions they'd held for weeks. "Now's our chance," George barked into his comlink. "All units, push forward." He turned to Colonel Briggs, who nodded grimly. "Major Fraser, you're up." Fraser's voice crackled over the channel. "Roger that. We'll give these bastards something to run from." George's fingers flew over a tactical display. "I'm taking a strike team to hit their orbital shipyards. Keep them off balance down here." Briggs clasped George's shoulder. "Good hunting, sir." As Fraser's troops surged forward, George assembled his strike force. He eyed the motley crew. Grizzled human veterans stood shoulder to shoulder with lanky Elysian resistance fighters. "Listen up," George addressed them. "We're hitting the Zorgaks where it hurts. Those shipyards go down, their whole supply chain crumbles." He gestured to a row of captured Zorgaks fighters. "Hope you're ready for some on-the-job training." The alien craft's controls were a nightmare of unfamiliar buttons and levers. George's fingers danced across the console, muscle memory from countless simulations kicking in. "All units, report in," he ordered as they lifted off. A chorus of affirmatives filled the comm. George's eyes narrowed as the looming bulk of the Zorgak's shipyards came into view. "Elysian bombers, commence feint attack," he commanded. A swarm of Elysian craft suddenly appeared, pummeling the shipyard's outer defenses. Zorgak's fighters scrambled to intercept. "That's our cue," George growled. "Strike team, follow me in." They dove through the chaos, weaving between explosions and debris. Warning klaxons blared as they breached the perimeter. George's fighter touched down with a bone-jarring thud. He leapt out, pulse rifle at the ready. "Alpha team with me," he shouted. "Beta and Gamma, hit your designated targets." They sprinted through twisting corridors, the acrid stench of ozone filling the air. A Zorgak security team rounded the corner. George dropped to one knee, squeezing off a burst of plasma fire. The aliens fell in a tangle of limbs and core. "Status report," George barked into his comlink as they pushed deeper into the facility. "Beta team here," came the reply. "We've rigged the fuel depots to blow, moving to secondary objective." Gamma checking in. "Manufacturing sector's a mess, but we're encountering heavy resistance." George cursed under his breath. "Hold the line, Gamma. We're almost—" His words were cut off as a massive Zorgak's warrior barreled into him. They crashed to the deck in a tangle of thrashing limbs. George's rifle skittered away. Mandibles snapped inches from his face as George struggled to keep the alien at bay. He drove his knee up, feeling chitin crack. The Zorgaks howled in pain. George's hand closed around a fallen piece of debris. He brought it down hard on the alien's head. Once, twice, 3 times. The Zorgaks went limp. Panting, George staggered to his feet. "Objective secured," he wheezed into his comlink. "All teams, fall back to extraction points." They fought their way back to the landing bay, pursued by waves of enraged Zorgaks. George's team piled into their captured fighters, engines screaming as they lifted off. "This is Dixon," George called to the orbiting human fleet. "Shipyards are compromised. Light 'em up." A hail of fire rained down on the crippled facility. George watched with grim satisfaction as the shipyards crumbled into twisted, burning wreckage. His comlink crackled. "Commander Dixon, this is Major Fraser. You'll be happy to know we've got these overgrown cockroaches on the run." George allowed himself a small smile. "Outstanding work, Major. Let's finish this." As they descended through Elysia's atmosphere, George saw columns of Zorgak's troops surrendering to Fraser's forces. Cheering crowds of newly liberated Elysians filled the streets. But even as the immediate threat passed, George knew their war was far from finished. He clenched his fist, thinking of Keed and countless others who'd given their lives. "Prepare the fleet," he ordered. "We're taking this fight to the Zorgak's homeworld." George's eyes hardened as he looked to the stars. The real battle was just beginning. The human Elysian fleet emerged from hyperspace, a swarm of ships surrounding the imposing bulk of the UES Vengeance. George Dixon stood on the bridge, his eyes fixed on the holographic display of Zorgak's Imperial space. "Stealth probes deployed, sir," reported Lieutenant Chen. "Scanning for the throne world." George nodded, his eyes hardened. Hours passed as the probes combed through the sector. Finally, a ping. "We've got it," Chen announced. "Heavily fortified. Multiple orbital defense platforms. Ground-to-space weaponry unlike anything we've seen." George studied the readouts, his mind racing. A frontal assault would be suicide. They needed another way in. In the war room, George laid out his plan to a select group of human and Elysian special forces. "We infiltrate first, take down their defenses from the inside." Captain Vex, an Elysian with iridescent scales, leaned forward. "How do we get past their sensors?" George tapped a control, revealing schematics for sleek black armor. "Next-gen camo tech. Will be ghosts." The strike team touched down on the Zorgak's throne world under the cover of darkness. George led the way, his boots sinking into alien soil. The air felt thick, oppressive. They moved swiftly through a sprawling metropolis of twisted metal and chitinous structures. Zorgak's patrols buzzed overhead, searchlights sweeping the streets. "Down!" George hissed. The team flattened against a wall as a Zorgak's security detail marched past. George held his breath, praying the camo held. After agonizing seconds, the aliens moved on. They pressed deeper into enemy territory. Vex suddenly grabbed George's arm, pointing. A shimmering energy field blocked their path. "Disintegration barrier," Vex whispered. "One touch, you're atoms." George cursed under his breath. They'd have to find another way around. A distant explosion rocked the city. The diversion was working. The bulk of the Zorgak's fleet was moving to engage the attackers. The team finally reached their target, a heavily guarded compound housing the planet's defense grid. George nodded to his tech expert. "Do your thing." As they worked to hack the system, a voice rang out. "Intruders! Sound the alarm!" George whirled to see a group of Elysians, traitors working for the Zorgaks. Plasma fire erupted from all sides. "Take cover!" George shouted, diving behind a console. The battle raged, but they were outnumbered. George watched in horror as Vex and 2 human soldiers were dragged away by Zorgak's troops. "Fall back!" George ordered. "We need a new plan." They melted into the shadows of the alien city, forced to abandon their original mission. George's mind raced. They had to rescue their captured teammates and still find a way to bring down those defenses. For days, they waged a guerrilla war in the streets of the Zorgak's capital. Hit-and-run attacks kept the enemy off balance, but time was running out. George crouched in an abandoned building, studying a holographic map of a towering structure. "That's where they're holding our people. We go in tonight." Under the cover of darkness, they infiltrated the Zorgak's prison. Alarms blared as they fought their way through twisting corridors. George blasted the lock off a cell, revealing Vex and the others. "Took you long enough?" Vex grinned weakly. With the team reunited, they made one final push for the defense grid. George's fingers flew over alien controls, disabling security protocols one by one. "It's done," he breathed. "Defenses are down." The sky lit up as the human Elysian fleet punched through the weakened orbital defenses. Dropships streamed toward the surface, disgorging waves of troops. George watched as battles erupted across the city. He keyed his comm. "All units, push for the Imperial Palace. We end this now." They fought their way through the streets, linking up with fresh Alliance forces. The palace loomed ahead, a grotesque edifice of twisted metal and pulsing organic material. Inside, they battled through halls lined with the trophies of 1,000 conquered worlds. George's blood boiled at the sight. They burst into the throne room, a cavernous space dominated by a massive chitinous throne. The Zorgak's emperor rose, multifaceted eyes gleaming with malice. "So," the emperor's voice grated, "the primitives dare to challenge me." George raised his weapon. "Your reign of terror ends here." The emperor lunged impossibly fast. George dodged, feeling the rush of air as razor-sharp claws missed him by inches. They clashed again and again, a deadly dance across the throne room. George's muscles screamed as he parried blow after blow. The Emperor was toying with him, wearing him down. He had to end this. In a risky move, George feinted left, then drove his combat knife deep into a gap in the Emperor's armor. Ichor sprayed as the blade found its mark. The Emperor staggered, then collapsed. As the light faded from those alien eyes, the dying ruler spoke. "Fool," the Emperor rasped. "Even now, my vengeance is unleashed. Your precious Elysia burns." George's blood ran cold. "What are you talking about?" A gurgling laugh. "The bioweapon is launched. Your allied world dies with me." Horror washed over George as the Emperor's life ebbed away. He grabbed his comm. "All units, we have a new primary objective. We need to find and stop that weapon." George Dixon sprinted through the chaos of the Imperial Palace, his mind racing. The Emperor's final words echoed in his ears. Elysia, bioweapon. Time was running out. "Strike team, on me," he barked into his comm. "We need to find that weapon." They fought their way through corridors littered with debris and fallen Zorgacs, following intel from captured data terminals. A massive blast door loomed ahead, emblazoned with alien glyphs. "This is it," George muttered. "Breaching charges." The door exploded inward. They surged into a cavernous laboratory filled with bubbling vats and pulsing machinery. Zorgak scientists scurried for cover. Plasma bolts sizzled through the air. George dove behind an overturned console as return fire erupted from security forces. "Williams, left flank!" George shouted. Sergeant Williams nodded, vaulting over a row of workstations. His rifle chattered, dropping 2 Zorgak's guards. But a lucky shot caught him in the chest. Williams stumbled, firing wildly as he fell. "Man down!" George yelled, scrambling to reach his fallen comrade. Williams grabbed George's arm, blood bubbling from his lips. "Go! Stop them!" George gritted his teeth and pushed forward. They fought their way deeper into the facility, past emergency bulkheads and frenzied Zorgak's defenders. Finally, they reached the central control room. George's eyes widened at the sight of a towering cybernetic Zorgak's warrior, its body a nightmarish fusion of chitinous armor and gleaming metal. "Jex, with me," George called to his Elysian counterpart. "The rest of you, keep those reinforcements off our backs." The cyborg moved with terrifying speed, metal claws slashing the air where George's head had been a split second before. Jex fired, his energy bolts sparking harmlessly off the creature's armored hide. George rolled under a vicious swipe, coming up with his combat knife. He drove the blade deep into a gap in the cyborg's armor. It howled, a sound like grinding gears, and smashed George across the room. Dazed, George watched as Jex leapt onto the cyborg's back, jamming an electro-disruptor into its skull. The creature convulsed, systems overloading. With a final, desperate lunge, it crashed into the main control panel before collapsing in a smoking heap. Sparks flew from the ruined console. Indicator lights flashed red across the room. "Damn it!" George snarled, frantically working the controls. "The launch sequence is still active, but I can't access it from here." Jex's multifaceted eyes narrowed. There must be a manual override. George nodded grimly. "In the silo. Let's move." They descended into the bowels of the facility, the distant sounds of battle echoing behind them. Catwalks and access tunnels formed a dizzying maze around the central shaft housing the bioweapon. "There!" Jex pointed to a pulsing crystal formation deep within the weapon's core. "The launch key!" George's blood ran cold as he saw the network of explosive charges surrounding the area. "It's rigged to blow if we try to access it." They shared a look of grim understanding. There was only one way to stop this. "On 3, George said quietly. Jex nodded. 1, 2, 3. They lunged forward in unison, George's hand closing around the launch key as Jex triggered the destruct sequence. The silo shuddered as explosions began to cascade through the structure. "Go!" Jex shouted, shoving George towards the exit. "I'll hold them off." George hesitated for a split second, then ran. Jex's weapons fire echoed behind him as he sprinted through collapsing tunnels. He burst out of the facility just as it imploded, a massive fireball consuming the launch silo. Panting, covered in dust and blood, George activated his comlink. "This is Dixon. Bioweapon neutralized. Repeat, bioweapon neutralized." His moment of relief was shattered by an urgent transmission. "All units, this is command. Zorgax forces have initiated orbital bombardment. Evacuate immediately." George's eyes widened as he saw the sky filling with thousands of attack drones. He sprinted towards the nearest spaceport, barking orders into his comm. "This is Commander Dixon. All Alliance personnel, fall back to evac points. We are leaving this rock." He commandeered an armed transport, systems coming to life under his hands. As they lifted off, the horizon erupted in flames. George piloted the ship through a gauntlet of anti-aircraft fire, weaving between streams of plasma that lit up the sky. Wave after wave of Alliance ships clawed their way into orbit, regrouping with the main fleet. George's transport shuddered as a near miss grazed their hull. Admiral Briggs' voice crackled over the comm. "All ships accounted for. Prepare to disengage." His words were cut off by a massive explosion. George watched in horror as Briggs's flagship split apart under concentrated Zorgax fire. "This is Dixon," he called, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "All ships, form up on me. We're not done yet." He studied the tactical display, a plan forming. The Zorgax capital ships were closing fast, but the debris field from the planetary bombardment offered cover. "Here's what we're going to do," George addressed the fleet. "We'll use the debris as cover. Lure them in close, then hit them from all sides. They won't expect us to turn and fight." He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of command settle on his shoulders. "This is our chance to deal a real blow. Are you with me?" A chorus of affirmatives filled the comm channel. George's hands tightened on the controls as he led the battered Alliance fleet into position. "All ships, weapons hot," he ordered. "Wait for my signal." The Zorgax fleet loomed closer, their sensors confused by the debris field. George watched the range indicator tick down. "Now!" he roared. Alliance ships erupted from their hiding spots, energy weapons blazing. Taken by surprise, the Zorgax formations shattered. George's transport dove through the melee, weaving between capital ships. George Dixon stood on the bridge of the Alliance flagship, his eyes fixed on the tactical display. The holographic map showed a sea of red Zorgax forces, but scattered among them were the faint blue signatures of cloaked Alliance vessels. "Status report," George barked, his voice taut with tension. Lieutenant Chen's fingers danced across her console. "All strike teams in position, sir, awaiting your command." George nodded, his face hardened. The past months had been a brutal campaign of hit-and-run attacks. He'd pushed his forces to the brink, striking Zorgax supply lines and shipyards with ruthless efficiency. Now, it was time for the killing blow. "Commence Operation Phantom," George ordered. Across the sector, cloaked Alliance ships sprang into action. On a Zorgax fuel depot, security alarms blared as explosions rocked the facility. Confused Zorgax troops scrambled to respond, their insectoid eyes scanning for an enemy they couldn't see. In a nearby shipyard, Alliance commandos materialized from thin air, their cloaking fields shimmering as they deactivated. Plasma fire erupted, cutting down Zorgax workers before they could raise the alarm. George watched the tactical display light up with dozens of simultaneous attacks. He leaned forward, hands gripping the command rail. "Push them hard, don't let up." On the Zorgax homeworld, the Imperial High Command was in chaos. Admiral Krasazik chittered furiously at his subordinates. "How are they striking everywhere at once? Find them." But the Alliance forces were ghosts, appearing and vanishing at will. Zorgax fleets scrambled to respond, only to find smoking ruins where their bases had been moments before. George's voice crackled over the Alliance command channel. "All units, execute Phase 2. The true brilliance of his plan unfolded. As the Zorgax rushed to defend their core worlds, Alliance forces struck at the now exposed outer colonies. Entire systems fell in hours, cut off from reinforcement. On the bridge of his flagship, George allowed himself a grim smile. The Zorgax Empire was crumbling, its forces scattered and disorganized. Victory was within reach. But he knew the price paid to reach this moment. The faces of fallen comrades flashed through his mind, Williams, Jex, and countless others. George's hands tightened on the command rail. He would see this through, despite the toll. "Prepare the fleet for the final push," George ordered. "We end this war today." The Alliance armada surged forward, no longer relying on stealth. It was time for an all-out assault on the Zorgax throne world. As his ships entered formation, George squared his shoulders. The future of humanity and their Elysian allies hung in the balance. "All hands," George's voice rang out across the fleet. "Prepare for combat drop." George Dixon stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Retribution, his eyes fixed on the holographic display before him. The vast expanse of Zorgax space stretched out in a web of pulsing red nodes, each representing a critical target. "All strike teams, this is Dixon. Operation Phantom commences on my mark." George's voice was steady as he addressed the fleet. "Remember, absolute radio silence once you're deployed. Good hunting." A chorus of acknowledgments filled the comm channel. George took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. Mark. The Alliance fleet split apart, cloaking fields shimmering as ships vanished into the void. George watched as the tactical display showed his forces spreading out across Zorgax space like a deadly web. Hours ticked by in tense silence. Then, precisely on schedule, chaos erupted. Proximity alarms blared as Alliance ships decloaked, weapons blazing. On a Zorgax supply depot orbiting a gas giant, plasma torpedoes slammed into fuel tanks. The resulting explosion lit up the planet's rings, debris scattering in a fiery cloud. At a shipyard in the Thraxis sector, Alliance commandos materialized inside the control center. The insectoid Zorgax workers barely had time to react before precision fire cut them down. Reactor cores were sabotaged, assembly lines destroyed. George's tactical display erupted with activity as reports flooded in. Supply depots, communications relays, and military outposts across Zorgax space went dark in rapid succession. "Sir," Lieutenant Chen called out, "Imperial Rapid Response fleets are mobilizing." George nodded, a grim smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Right on cue. Initiate Phase 2. A small Alliance battle group decloaked near the Zorgax fortress world of Krizal, unleashing a barrage of fire on its orbital defenses. The response was immediate. Zorgax warships poured out of their defensive positions, swarming towards the perceived threat. "Now," George ordered. Behind the surging Zorgax armada, Alliance ships shimmered into view. Their weapons found vulnerable points in the enemy's exposed flanks and rear. Precision volleys crippled engines and weapons systems. George watched the unfolding carnage with cold satisfaction. Press the advantage. Don't let up. As the Zorgax fleet burned, George turned his attention to their true target. "All ships, form up on me. We're taking out those shipyards." The Retribution led the charge, punching through the gaps in the Zorgax defenses. As they approached the massive Imperial shipyards, George's cloaked vanguard sprang one final trap. Ghost ships appeared among the Zorgax defenders, sowing confusion with false IFF signals and targeting data. In the ensuing chaos, the Alliance fleet slipped through. "All ships, open fire," George commanded. A storm of missiles and energy beams lashed out, striking construction bays and assembly lines. Incomplete Zorgax vessels shattered under the onslaught. Dry docks crumbled, spilling their contents into space. George watched as the mighty Imperial shipyards, once the engine of Zorgax military might, burned. "Status report," he called out. Lieutenant Chen's fingers danced across her console. "Sir, Zorgax ship production capabilities have been reduced by an estimated 78%. They won't be able to replace their losses." For the first time in months, George allowed himself a moment of hope. The Zorgak's juggernaut was faltering, but he knew the fight was nowhere near the end. "Set course for the Forge Worlds," he ordered. "It's time to take out their resource base." As the Alliance fleet regrouped, preparing for their next assault, George's thoughts turned to the intel recovered from the Zorgak's throne world. Something lurked in the depths of their space, a power even the Zorgaks feared. He pushed the thought aside, focusing on the battle at hand, one threat at a time. George Dixon stood motionless on the bridge of the Retribution, his eyes fixed on the swirling nebula before him. The reports of victory against the Zorgaks felt hollow now, overshadowed by the weight of what he'd discovered in their most guarded sector. "Sir, we've cleared the last checkpoint," Lieutenant Chen reported, "entering the no-go zone." George nodded, his eyes sharp. "Maintain stealth protocols. We can't risk alerting whatever's out there." The ship plunged into the nebula's roiling clouds, cosmic energies lashing against the hull. Alarms blared as sensors struggled to make sense of the chaotic environment. "Multiple contacts," Chen called out. "Zorgak's interceptors on an intercept course." "Evasive maneuvers," George ordered. "Weapons hot, but hold fire unless absolutely necessary." The Retribution danced through the nebula, its cloaking field straining against the onslaught of radiation. Zorgak's ships screamed past, weapons blazing blindly into the cosmic fog. As they pushed deeper, a massive shape loomed out of the chaos. Tartarus Station hung before them, a grotesque amalgamation of Zorgak's technology and unknown horrors. "Dear God," George whispered, taking in the scale of the facility. They docked at a miraculously intact spoke, the airlock hissing open to reveal the station's interior. George led his team inside, their boots clanging on metal grates. The corridors were a charnel house of desiccated Zorgak's corpses. Twisted metal and shattered force fields spoke of unimaginable violence. "What happened here?" one of the team members asked, his voice tight with fear. George shook his head. "Nothing good, stay alert." They pushed deeper, uncovering fragments of the station's dark purpose. Corrupted data screens flickered with equations beyond human comprehension. Suddenly, the very fabric of reality seemed to shudder. George's armor sparked and sputtered, systems going haywire. "We've got company," he shouted, as automated defenses sprang to life. Decompression alarms wailed as bulkheads sealed around them. The team fought desperately, their weapons barely effective against the station's otherworldly guardians. George forged ahead, driven by a terrible certainty. In the heart of Tartarus he found it, a pulsing crystalline structure, shot through with veins of dark energy. As he approached, the air itself seemed to warp and twist. A voice that wasn't a voice filled his mind. "Intruder, defiler, you will be cleansed." George reeled as alien concepts assaulted his consciousness. He saw the birth of stars and the death of galaxies, all compressed into a single, searing instant. "What are you?" he gasped, fighting to maintain his sanity. The entity's response was a torrent of information, overwhelming in its scope. George glimpsed the hubris of the Zorgaks, their attempts to harness forces beyond mortal ken. He understood then, this was no mere weapon. It was an abomination, a cancer in the very fabric of reality. As the station shuddered around them, George made his choice. "Overload the reactors!" he ordered. "We're taking this thing down!" The battle that followed defied description. Reality itself seemed to bend and break as the crystalline entity lashed out. George's team fought not just for their lives, but for the very existence of the universe as they knew it. In the end, it came down to George alone, his mind locked in combat across infinite quantum fronts. The entity invaded his thoughts, seeking to corrupt and assimilate. But in that moment of ultimate peril, George found clarity. He saw the entity for what it truly was, powerful beyond imagining, yet fundamentally limited by its origins. With a supreme effort of will, he turned the entity's power back on itself, trapping it in a loop of its own making. As Tartarus Station tore itself apart around them, George's surviving team members dragged him to safety, a pulsing containment sphere clutched in his arms. They fled through a gauntlet of wormholes, each jump taking them further from known space. Finally, in a remote pocket of the cosmos, they released their terrible burden. George watched as the quantum prison took shape, layers of energy and exotic matter forming an impenetrable barrier. The entity raged within, its fury muted but undiminished. Exhausted beyond measure, George turned away from the prison. The war was over, but he knew the true battle had only just begun. As long as that spark of malevolence endured, the entire universe hung in the balance.
You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.